Now, the next step is applying what we learned here to our TinDog website. And we need to make this section a 6-unit column so that it takes up half of the screen, and this image to be another 6-unit column so it takes up the right side 50% of the screen. But when it goes on to a smaller size, say tablet or mobile, we want it to take up 100% of the width.
Đó là đang nói là hôm trước đã làm xong cái này rồi. À đâu? Các bạn chưa chuyển xong thì hình như đến đâu rồi ấy. Xem cái này là
so that we can see the image working exactly as we want.
làm màu các thứ xong
So
hết
the
đúng không? Là hôm trước là xong cái
thing
này
to make our
rồi. Xong cái video đây rồi. Là red hay là blue? Thứ tự ưu tiên á. Nếu mà cái một là đỏ nha, cái hai là xanh nha. Thì nếu mà để cái một cái nào đằng sau thì nó sẽ là trước. Cái hai đằng ở dưới này thì nó sẽ là xanh. Còn cái một ở dưới là đỏ. Đúng rồi. Siết từ dưới lên trên. Tức là bây giờ mình phải đưa cái này của mình xuống dưới cái Bootstrap để cho nó lên đầu tiên đấy. Có khi nào là mình chưa để xuống dưới không? Bịt mã. Brown.
Now, the next Bootstrap element I want to talk about are containers. So if you head over to documentation and go to layout, in the overview section, you can see that the first thing that they talk about are containers. And containers are a basic building block for a lot of the components in Bootstrap. It's actually required when you use a lot of Bootstrap components. For example, when you use a grid system, as we saw previously, you can see that all of these grids were in fact contained inside a container. And this is really, really useful because it allows you to horizontally center or to pad out your content by simply using this container. So let's take a look at containers in more detail. So I've created a new code play that I'm just going to call Bootstrap for container. And I'm going to change again the Bootstrap framework to 4.0, hit save. And now I'm going to create a new div that's going to have a class of container. And inside the div, of course, I need a little bit of content for it to be visible. So in this case, I'm just going to copy the lorem ipsum that I've got from this website so that I can use it to pad out my div. So the last thing I want to do is add a little bit of background color to maybe red again. Let's hit run, and we've got this container that contains all the text that's inside. Now, of course, you can contain anything you want, for example, divs or buttons or tables, anything you need. But this component, what it does is if I pop this out as a window, you can see that we've got our container that's colored in red. Now, it's automatically responsive. So what that means is that as I go through, so going from desktop to laptop to tablet to mobile sized, you can see that the maximum width of the container jumps through different values. And you can see these values if you just simply inspect on the container. So let's select the container and let's watch this max width value. So at the moment, we're on the largest size. So this is the sort of laptop size. And as the width goes down, so let's make that first jump to the smaller desktop size, you can see that our max width is now 960. Let's go to the tablet size. You can see it made another jump to 720 max width. And finally to the mobile size, which is now max width 540 pixels. So this allows anything that's contained inside your container to be fully responsive relative to the size of the viewport. Now, for some people, this might seem a little bit jarring as it jumps around a bit. So the other type of containers that you have is what's called a fluid container. And fluid containers take up 100% of the width. So let's copy this container and paste another one below and change this one to a container fluid. Let's change the color to yellow and let's run that. So let's pop this out as a full screen, you can see the difference now as I go through the different breakpoints. So as we go from the large desktop to the smaller desktops, you can see that the normal container is jumping through the different widths, but the fluid container is simply adapting to the width of the screen and always taking up 100% of the screen width. So I want to use a container inside our website to be able to add padding and centering to our content, but I don't want that jumpiness from the normal container. So instead, I want to use a fluid container. So let's head into our index.html, and I want to include the navigation bar along with the title and the images in the same container. So let's add a div just around here, and let's give that class a container-fluid. And we're going to put the closing div just before the closing tag. And now if we go ahead and beautify our code, then you can see that that div now wraps around our nav bar as well as the title section. So now we can go ahead and select that div and style it in our CSS. So the class that we're going to select is the
VS Code cũng có beautify mà. Trong VS Code có beautify mà. Nên từ có mà, có. Yeah. Hello. Hello. Tao bảo là mày muốn xem cái beautify hả? Nhưng mà tao không dùng VS Code đâu.
container-fluid. And even though Bootstrap already has some pre-added styles to this, we are going to make it a little bit more personalized to our purposes. Namely, we're going to add some padding, and we're going to add it to all four sides. So we're going to add 3% padding to the top and bottom, and 15% to the left and the right. And now, if we hit save, we can check out what it looks like with that container. If I switch on pesticide, you can see that we've got this large box that goes all the way around, including the navigation bar, as well as all the stuff in the title section. So now we can group everything together and start working on our components inside the container. So in the next lesson, we're going to learn about another Bootstrap component to style up our title page further, and that is going to be the Bootstrap Buttons. And we're going to use it to style up our download buttons to make it look nice. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.
Mày làm chưa? Mày làm không chưa? Thêm container vào này. Thêm container vào. Rồi đi. Biết rồi.
Now, we're steadily getting closer to our final design for our front page header, but one of the things that you notice is that our download buttons still look extraordinarily out of place. They don't look like they've been styled at all, even though they are using Bootstrap. So in this lesson, I want to talk about another Bootstrap component, which is the Bootstrap button. Now, if you head over to the documentation for the Bootstrap buttons, so just go to Documentation, Components, Buttons, then you can see that there's a whole bunch of buttons that we can choose from. And they come with the Bootstrap palette, which allows you to simply use one of these classes, for example, button-primary for a blue button and button-warning for a yellow button, etc. Now, there's also other types of buttons. For example, you can have outline buttons, which become filled in as you hover over them, which looks pretty nice. Now, you can also have larger or smaller buttons, or buttons that take up the entire width of the parent. Now, because we've seen this before and we played around with this in a previous lesson, I want you as a challenge to add a dark and light button to style our download buttons here. And it should look somewhat like this as the final outcome. So these are large buttons, and the left one is dark and the right one is a outlined light button. So pause the video and see if you can complete that challenge with the help of the Bootstrap documentation.
Alo, làm không? Thôi kệ đi.
Cô hát đi làm một lần luôn. Chứ giờ cái
All
bao
right,
biết
so
làm gì đâu.
how did that go? All right, so let's head into Atom and let's find the relevant section first. So here is our title section with our little comment here, and we've got our two download buttons. Now, they are button elements of type button, so all we need to do here in order to implement these Bootstrap styles is just to add a class. So after the type, I'm going to add a class, and the first one to make it into a Bootstrap button is btn, and the next one specifies what type of button I want. So the left one, I wanted a dark button, and that's filled in already. So I will go for the button dark, so btn dark. So let's hit save and let's check to see if we got what we wanted, which looks pretty close, right? And then the next one we wanted was a light outlined button for the one on the right. So let's scroll down to the outline buttons and let's find that light one, which is almost imperceptible because the background is white, but we can see it when we hover over it. So this is the one that we're looking for. And this requires the class button outline light, which is a little bit longer. So let's head over here and again add another class. And this one is btn-outline-light. Hit save and refresh. And we've now got our button styles down. Now you notice that we specified that we wanted the larger buttons here. So let's head into Bootstrap again and look at the sizes section of the button component. And you can see that just by simply adding a class called button-large or button-small, we can change the size of our buttons without touching the CSS. So let's go and add yet another class to our button, which is btn-large or LG, both of them. And let's hit save. Let's head back and refresh. And now we've got some lovely Bootstrap buttons, making our website look a lot nicer than before. Now, one thing you might notice that I've got here in our final version of the website that we don't yet have over here are these pretty little glyphs or icons on the left of our download buttons. Now, these things come from a website called Font Awesome, and it is really, really awesome. And the reason is because they have over 900 icons, which are free for commercial use. And they have a really, really generous license, which means that the icons are open source and completely free for use in any of your websites. So head over here and we're going to go over to the icon section in order to try and find our Apple and Google Play icons. So let's search for Apple, and the first one that comes up is the one that we want. You can see that this is the full vector that they've drawn, and you can see it in the various different sizes or how it looks with different backgrounds, and they've even styled it and put it into, you know, some common usage scenarios so that you can imagine what it might look like. So in order to use it, all we need to do is just to copy this line, and you can see that similar to Bootstrap, it's implementing these glyphs by adding a couple of classes. So firstly, you've got the Font Awesome button, fab, and then you've got Font Awesome-Apple, which specifies exactly which glyph or which icon you're looking to insert. Now, before we can use this, however, similar to Bootstrap, we need to add Font Awesome to our website. So let's head over to Get Started. And the first thing you see is use the Font Awesome free CDN. So similar to what we had with Bootstrap, Font Awesome has a CDN that distributes the resource, so the Font Awesome icons, and allows you to embed this into your website so that any users who've never opened a website that required Font Awesome, they'd be able to go here and download it. So let's go ahead and copy this and insert it into our website. So just below where we've got our CSS, I'm going to paste this in, and this is probably a good time to start commenting on what some of these things are. And as you find your code getting more lengthy and more complex, it's a good idea to start commenting on things so that you remember later on when you come back what everything is all about. So the first one, we've got our Google fonts. So the way that I prefer to do it is just to type out plain text, highlight it, and then hit Command or hold down Control in Windows and hit /, and that basically comments that particular line of text. So those are the Google fonts, and these are the CSS style sheets. And then we've got our Font Awesome, and finally we have our Bootstrap scripts. Put that in as well. So now when we come back to this, we can see easily at a glance what we've got over here. And it's a good idea to sprinkle these around in your code so that it's really clear to yourself or anybody else who looks at your code what everything is all about. And also, as you're doing the tutorials and you're learning about these different components or how you use selectors in CSS, etc., all of these new concepts, once you understood what they're all about, you can add a comment to remind yourself in case you come back to it at a later date. So let's hit save, and let's go ahead and go back to that icon that we found, which was Apple. And let's copy this line of code, and we can now insert it wherever we want to use it, because we now have that CDN where we can download and derive any icons that we want to use. So let's go back to our download button, and just in the text section, so between the button elements, I'm going to insert this icon, and then I'm going to insert a space in between. Now you'll notice that by default, Font Awesome likes to use the I tag. So this is the italic tag, which is not that great in terms of HTML best practice. But the reason that they can use it is because glyphs and icons are not italicized, so it doesn't become slanted. And they say that they use it just because the I tag is pretty much the shortest tag that can be used for this purpose. So you can use what they recommend, which is the I tag, or if you prefer to have a more semantically understandable HTML code, then you can change that into a span as well. And you'll see either the I or the span when people are using Font Awesome out in the wild. So I'm just going to leave it as it is because it is short and it is quite easy to spot. Now let's hit save and see what this looks like. So let's hit refresh, and you can see we've now got a little Apple icon, a space, and then our download text. So as a challenge, I want you to go into Font Awesome and find the Google Play icon and implement that in your code so that you have the second button that looks a bit like this. So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so that shouldn't be very hard. We just had to go back to the Font Awesome page and search for Google Play. And now we've got our icon showing up, and this is exactly what we want. And we can just copy this line of code and paste it where we pasted our last icon, which is just before the download button. And then we hit space. Now make sure that you're not pasting it into the actual button element, because it's actually a separate piece of text that belongs between the element tags. So now let's hit save and let's go back and refresh. We've now got an Apple download icon and a Google Play download icon. So it's looking pretty good so far. Now, in the next lesson, I want to finish styling up the title section of our website so that it looks more like this. Now, if you want to give it a go before I start walking you through the step-by-step, then you can just simply pause this video right now and look at the design that I've got on screen and try to use a combination of documentation, so CSS documentation, along with Bootstrap documentation, and maybe sometimes you might need to search for something on Stack Overflow, especially how you might get this image to rotate. So there's quite a bit of styling involved, and this is completely optional, but I do recommend giving it a go yourself before watching me go through the solution, just so that you start thinking and challenging yourself on how you might do this yourself. So pause the video now and make a copy of your project as it is now to mess around with and try to complete this challenge. Otherwise, I will see you on the next lesson. All right, so in order to get to where we are right now, we've learned about a number of Bootstrap components. For example, the navigation bar, the Bootstrap Buttons, Bootstrap Containers, Grids, and the responsiveness that we get using Bootstrap for layout purposes. Now, before we carry on, I want to add some more CSS code, so normal boggled standard CSS, so that we can customize all of our Bootstrap components and make our title page look a little bit more like our design on Balsamic. So let's get started. Now, the first thing that you may or may not have noticed, there are some different fonts going on here. The navbar uses the Bootstrap default font, as does the navbar brand, as does the text in our buttons, and also, of course, the rest of our unstyled web page. Now, instead of going into the button and going into the navbar and adding CSS to each of them, changing the font, I want you to think if you can figure out a way of changing all of the text to the Montserrat font that we got from Google Fonts. So pause the video and see if you can complete this mini challenge. All right, so this shouldn't be too hard because we've done it before. Now, what is the one thing that encompasses all of our content for our website? Well, it's the body element, because all the content is embedded inside it, and we can simply define a global font for the body in order to apply it to all the text on screen. So I'm going to target the body element, and I'm going to change the font family to Montserrat, and I'm going to close it off with a semicolon. So let's hit save and let's go back and refresh. You can see that all the text now has changed to our chosen font, which makes it look a little bit more unified and gets us closer to our final design. So the next thing that I want to change is I want this title text to have a white color so that it matches with the color palette that we've got going on here, which is this kind of red and white kind of scheme for our imaginary tin dog product. So one way of doing this is going into the H1 that we've already selected here and adding a color property and setting it to white. Now, the other way of doing this is adding it to the title section, which, if you remember, the H1 is residing inside. So this line is inside our title section. And by changing the color of all text in the title section, if later on I decide to add a subtitle or, a little bit of explainer text or whatever it may be, it will still keep to our current color scheme. So it's a little bit more encompassing. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to add our color property and I'm going to set it to white. So as a shorthand, remember that the color hex code for $FFF is always going to be white and $000 is always going to be black. And you can see our pigments add-on showing you that. So I want white. Let's hit save and let's refresh. You can see we've now got our white big title, which looks brilliant. Now, don't worry if you added your color to the H1. It's perfectly valid, and we can always refactor our code later on if we see we're duplicating any part or, if we want to make our code more succinct. So that's completely acceptable, and it's not wrong at all. So now that
nó khác nhau thôi, ID với class là nó khác nhau, dùng cho mục đích khác nhau chứ ở cái nào ưu tiên cái nào. Là trong cái ID á. Title đúng không? Đúng rồi. Ưu tiên cái gì hơn? Nếu bây giờ viết ra ID thì mới ưu tiên chứ, hôm trước đã viết ID đâu.
that we've styled the text on our page, the next thing I want to look at is this navbar, because you can see that the text is a little bit too small and this brand should really be a little bit more prominent. And also I want to make it look a little bit more like the Tinder logo, because we are making a copycat product here after all. And the closest logo that I found on Google Fonts was the Ubuntu font, which we already incorporated when we embedded our Google Fonts into our website. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, before I do that, I want to add a new section, and I'm going to say navigation bar, and I'm going to use that good old trick of highlighting it and command / to style it. I find this much easier than typing a bunch of asterisks and /. Now here we're going to first target our nav brand. So navbar -brand, and I want to change the font family to Ubuntu. So font family, and that's going to be Ubuntu. Now let's hit save and refresh, and you can see that that T lot like the T for Tinder now, but it's still too small. So let's increase the font size as well to 2.5 rem. And maybe while we're here, we can make font weight to bold as well. Hit save and refresh, and you can see that now we've got this navbar brand, which looks a lot better, and it makes us seem like we're more proud of what we're called. Looks a lot better, and it makes us seem like we're more proud of what we're called rather than as if we're trying to hide it with our tiny text. Now, with the bigger font size for the navbar brand, you start to notice that it's a little bit awkward having it so close to our title text and image. So ideally, I would like to push down any content and have a bit of padding at the bottom of our navbar because it would make it look a lot nicer. So I don't really want to add any padding to the top or the left and right. So can you think of a way in which we can set the bottom padding to 4.5 rem without touching the padding on any other side of the navbar? So again, mini challenge, pause the video if you want to complete it. All right, so I'm going to put this just above our navbar brand because it's more broad and it targets the navbar instead of any component inside the navbar. So it's a higher level div. So I tend to add my selectors in that kind of order, going from less specific to more specific as you scroll down. And also I try to keep the CSS styling roughly in the order that you see on the page. So the title section will go first, then the next section, then the next section. It just makes it a little bit easier to change and to fix later on. Now, in the navbar, we want to change the padding, and we only want to touch the padding bottom, and we want to set it to 2.5, and we want to set it to 4.5 rem. Hit save and refresh, and now we've got a little bit more space in between that navbar and the title.
Đó. Hai pin mà. Xem được không?
Again, going to add some padding. I will keep this as a fixed size just because we've got that responsiveness, so I don't really need it as a percentage or as a rem. So I'm going to put in probably 18 pixels of padding left and right of each of these nav items. So we're going to go below the navbar brand. We're going to
Sao thế mày?
Bạn Sida.
Buổi tối mọn lắm.
Đi vào đi xem được chưa?
left and right. Hit save, refresh, bit more spaced out. Looks a lot nicer. We won't accidentally press on the wrong button, but they still need to be a little bit larger. So I'm going to dig even deeper inside the nav item. I'm going to target the actual nav link to style it. So we're going to target the nav link. So in this case, I'm going to change the font size, the font family, as well as the color so that we get a little bit more like this. So a little bit larger. And I'm also going to change the font weight to the Montserrat Light font. So it's not so prominent on the page. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's change the nav link's font size. Can change it to maybe about 1.2 rem. You can see it's just a little bit bigger, but it's a little bit too heavy in terms of weight at the moment. So let's change the font family to Montserrat Light, and this will thin those letters down and make it less prominent and blend in a bit better. Now let's take a look at how our navbar looks by activating pesticide, and you can see that this is the entire section, this blue section, and you can see that we've still got a bit of padding, it seems, left over from the top, the left and the right of our navbar, which is why that text is not aligning on the left with our title text here. So that is just a little bit off, and I suspect the reason is, if we inspect on this, is that the navbar actually has some padding in addition to the padding bottom that we added. So let's try and get rid of this padding, which came from probably the Bootstrap element. And we can do that by, instead of using padding bottom, to add padding and then add 0 to the top, 0 to the left and right, and 4.5 rem to the bottom only. So now if we refresh, you can see that our navbar brand now aligns perfectly with our title text and our buttons. And when you're designing websites or apps or whatever it may be, try to minimize on the number of lines that you can align things to, because it will usually make your designs look more together. So now I'm pretty happy with my navbar. So the next thing I'm going to deal with are these buttons. They're far too close to this title text, and they need a little bit of a margin to push it away from that text. So let's go into our CSS and add another section. Let's call it buttons. Maybe more specifically the download buttons. And let's comment that out so that we have our new section. Now, in order to target the button, I have a choice of either using the Bootstrap BTN class and customize the Bootstrap style, or I can add in my custom class. Now, in this situation, if you start getting lazy and using the existing class, you often find yourself in a situation later on when you want to use this button, but you don't want it to have the same amount of margin as you do in the title section. So usually it's much better to just add in a custom class, which is what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to call this our download button, and I'm going to apply that class to our Google Play button as well. So let's hit save, and now we can target it over here. And our download button needs a margin.
Em tao. Cái gì? BTN nó là class mà sao không sửa được? Nãy giờ đang sửa class của chính Bootstrap còn gì nữa? Đây à? Từ đoạn này đúng không? Từ đoạn này à?
Getting lazy and using the existing classes from Bootstrap, you often find yourself in a situation later on when you want to use this button, but you don't want it to have the same amount of margin as you do in the title section. So usually it's much better to just add in a custom class, which is what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to call this our download button, and I'm going to apply that class to our Google Play button.
Là cái này là class mày tự thêm vào để mày vào mày chỉnh ấy, hiểu không? Không đụng gì vào cái này cả.
Button as well. So let's hit save, and now we can target it over here. And our download button needs a margin that is, I've sort of been tweaking around with it, and the one that I find to work the best is about 5% on the top, 3% on the right, 5% on the left, and 0 on the bottom. So let's hit save and refresh, and you can see that that provides a large enough distance between the two buttons to make it take up roughly the amount of space that we've got for our title, and it makes our button aligned perfectly with the navbar brand as well as the title text. So that's what I quite liked when I was messing around with these numbers. But of course, feel free to play around with it yourself. So it's usually easiest if you just inspect on it and then just go into the box model and try changing some of these numbers and see what it ends up being for the design that you want. All right, so the very last thing I want to change is this image. That's all that we have left in our title section. And firstly, I want to make its width a little bit smaller, because at the moment it's kind of taking up as much width as it can. It's like full size right now. And I want it to be maybe 60% of its parent. So this is its parent, which is the containing div, which is our column large 6 on desktop, and column and 12 and a full width on iPad or mobile. But I want it to take up only maybe 60% of this width to make it a little bit narrower. So let's go and do that. So again, I'm going to add a new section. This is called title image. And let's add a comment there, and let's find out what class we need to use to target that image. And you can see at the moment our image is. Let's go ahead and I'm going to call the class maybe title image, and we can hit save. Now here I can use that class called title image, and we can make its width only 60% of what it used to be. Hit save, refresh, and you can see it's now a little bit smaller and less sort of assuming and less in your face, which makes a much better design, I think. Right, so the last and final thing that you might have been struggling to figure out is how do we get it to be rotated to the right? And this is the part where I said to you that you might need to search for it on Google. So as I've been saying, a lot of times getting good at development or programming is very often getting good at Google and knowing the right things to search for in order to get your answer. So in our case, we want to rotate an image using CSS, and let's see what we get with this search query. So we are getting some results from W3 Schools as well as MDN, and they seem to point towards something about transform, something about rotation. So I tend to prefer the MDN docs, so let's just take a look at what they talk about. And you can see that there is a CSS function called rotation. Now, we haven't really spoken much about functions, but we will do in the next section when we cover JavaScript. But for now, let's just see what we can do using this rotate function. So they've got a very simple bit of CSS code here where they're changing a transform property by using the rotate function, and then you specify the degree, the amount that you want to rotate your element by. And you can see in this case, the pink one, which is what this targets, is rotated 45 degrees to the right. So let's just open this in CodePen and have a mess around with it to fully understand what is happening. So let's take a look at the CSS section. So we've got this div, which is normal, which nothing really changed about it. And then we've got this div called rotated. With a class of rotated, which is what we are editing here. And what we've changed is the transform property using the rotate function, and we're specifying 45 degrees. So when it's positive, it rotates by 45 degrees to the right. If it's negative, it rotates by 45 degrees to the left, or rather anti-clockwise. And as you expect, 90 degrees is 90 degrees right rotation, 180 degrees is 180 degrees clockwise rotation. So this seems pretty simple, and we can probably figure out how we can use this to achieve what we want, which is something like this. So let's go into our CSS, and we're again targeting the title image in this case, and we're going to use what we just learned, which is changing the transform property to use the rotate function, and we're going to specify how much we are going to rotate by. Now, with repeat sort of experimentation, changing this number a few times, I found that 25 degrees tends to work quite well. So if you add 25 degrees in the positive and you refresh, you can see that we've now got that lovely right-sided rotation. So we are almost done here. The last thing that I want to do is just do a final sort of sense check, looking at this layout and seeing if we're happy with how it looks. And the one last thing that's a little bit niggling for me is that this title is kind of competing with this navbar brand. And whenever you're designing websites, you want to think about what is the first thing that you want the user to look at. You want to establish some sort of visual hierarchy. And you can do that using size, or you can do that using weight, so font weight, or you can do that using highlighting or outlining, a whole bunch of things basically. And in this case, even though this one has a much higher font weight than the navbar brand, it's kind of competing with it because it's about the same size. So let's just increase the title text size just by a smidge, and I'll show you the difference. So let's go ahead and change that font size from 3 rem to maybe say 3.5 rem, and let me show you what happens when I refresh. You can see now on this website, it's pretty obvious that the biggest, boldest thing is this heading here. And it's pretty much guaranteed that if you get a user to load up this website, the first thing that their eyes will be drawn to is this biggest, boldest title. And that's exactly what we want. We want them to immediately know what our product is about. And then the second most important thing should be maybe the download button, which are highlighted and outlined for them to start taking action. And then maybe the third most important thing is for them to know what our company is and what other things they can explore over here. So now that we've more or less finished styling our title section of our page, in the next lesson, we're going to move further down and continue with the other sections. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.
Nếu mà là trên màn hình máy tính thì nó ngang, còn thì sao? Gì? Chỗ nào? Sao? Mẫu thì đâu nhỉ? Đây đúng không? Nhưng bây giờ nó làm cho luôn mà. Thì xem lại record xong làm. Record xong làm. Không thì tao phải chụp màn hình cái này. Không thì tao phải chụp màn hình cái này. Chụp xong rồi lên rồi nhá.
All right, so how did you manage on that mini challenge? Well, if you haven't given it a go, then this is a good time to pause the video and just give it a try before I go through the solution with you. It's really, really important that you try and do this yourself because I can't be here with you every single time you try to make a website. So it's really, really important that you pick up on these skills by yourself. And remember, I'm watching you, but not in a creepy way. Just like, I haven't hacked your webcam or anything. I'm just, saying like metaphorically, Anyways, moving on. So, I presume that you've already given it a go and you've struggled and maybe you failed, maybe you succeeded. So we're going to run through the solution now. So essentially what we're trying to achieve is this outcome. We've got 3 features which each have a Font Awesome icon above them and they are responsive. So when we're in the iPad and the iPhone sizes, there's only 1 feature per row and they take up 100% of the width. Plus there's also the fonts and the colors, and also when you roll over these icons, they change a color. So we've learned how to do all of this before, and it's a matter of remembering it, giving it a go, and searching Google if we get stuck. So let's get started. So I'm going to keep the final piece over here just to compare, but the site as we have it up to now looks much less interesting and a bit more like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to give each of these features their own div, because as you can see at the moment, if we scroll down to the right section, I've got these 3 sets of features and they each have an H3 title and a paragraph just explaining the feature. And in order to get the responsiveness and to style each feature individually, I'm going to need to give them some form of identification. And that in HTML CSS is going to end up being a div. So I'm going to create 3 new divs and I'm going to give each div a custom class name. So I'm going to call them feature box, which seems to make sense to me. Doesn't really matter what you call them as long as they are the same, because we're going to apply the same style to each feature box. So let's create another div, feature box, and I'm just going to copy this and paste it, and we can now transplant these lines over to here. All right, great. So now we have our feature boxes and each set of features belongs in its own div, which we can style separately or apply the same style to each 3. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make each div take up 1/3 of the width of the screen on a large desktop or a laptop size screen. But when it's on an iPad or when it's on an iPhone, I want it to take up 100% of the width. So I can do that by applying some Bootstrap classes. So we remember that we have to use the column class and then we specify the size that we want it to be responsive to. So we're going to say column large, so that means laptop size and above is going to take up 1/3 of the row. And remember, each row is split up into 12 units, so 1/3 of 12 is 4 units. So column large 4, and let's just go ahead and paste this in the other 3 places. And if you load up your website right now, you'll see that nothing has changed. And that is because the Bootstrap grid requires that you nest it inside a class that has the name row. So we can specify which ones should go into the same row, essentially, so that your responsiveness can happen across different rows, for example. So something like column large 4 in 3 separate rows will be very different from all of them in the same row. So let's hit save and let's check it out and see if it worked. Okay, cool. So they are now laid across the same row, and they're taking up 1/3 of the screen each. And if I go into iPad size, you can see they're now taking up 100% of the width, as does anything smaller than that, so mobile size, still taking up 100% of the width. So we have succeeded. Ka-ching! I was planning on getting our sound designer to create these nice UI sounds for the video, but he is sick, so you will just have to live with my terrible sound effects. So it's like Angela SFX from now on. I've recently been trying to challenge my friends on what is the most realistic lightsaber activation sound you can produce without any instruments other than yourself, your own body. And I have found that many people are very bad at sound effects, myself probably included. Anyways, let's move on. I think I've had too much coffee today. I really apologize. All right, let's get back to work. The next thing I need to do is that you can see that at the moment our features are right up to the edge of both edges, and they're taking up a bit too much space. In order to get it looking a bit more like this, we need to add some padding. So the first bit of padding I'm going to add is to this feature section. So that's this big box here, and you can see the 3 parts highlighted. So we can go into our CSS and we can select the features section. So we are now down to title, image, and let's add features section. And let's just comment that out. So we can now target our features. And remember, it's an ID. So we have to use the hashtag or the £, and I'm going to add a padding around all 4 sides, and it's going to be 7% top and bottom and 15% left and right. So basically almost double the amount of space on the left and right as there is on the top and bottom. So now let's hit refresh, and you can see this is looking pretty nice, right? So each of our feature boxes are now centered in the middle of our feature div. And you can see that with that little bit more white space, it's much easier to read, a lot more organized, and it's getting close to what we want as our final outcome. So the amount of padding that you might have added might differ from mine, but as long as you got a similar end outcome, then that's absolutely fine. There's many, many ways of skinning a cat. It's probably not very vegan friendly. There's many ways to peel a carrot, maybe. Let me think on that. Oh boy, this video is going to need a lot of editing out. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is you can see that over here, our text is nicely centered inside each feature box, making them feel quite together. But here they look a bit weird, especially when you're using icons like this. You tend to want to have your text centered around the middle of the icon. Otherwise, if it's all left aligned, it looks a little bit strange. So let's go ahead and do that. So remember that previously we added this feature box class, which goes around each and every feature. So now we can target that feature box class, and we can say something like, all the text inside each feature box should be aligned to the center. So let's check it out. Yep, looking pretty good. Now, each line is still a little bit too long, so we can add a bit of padding inside each feature box so that we push it closer together so that the width goes down a little bit and we push all the text onto 2 lines, but it's very easy to glance and read rather than having these long lines. So I'm going to go ahead and add maybe around 5% of padding, and now our text is looking a lot shorter and a lot easier to read. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to change the fonts of these H3s that we've got over here. So you can see that each of the titles for the features are these H3s, which we can target quite easily up here. So we can say, let's change the font family to, I think we can change it to Montserrat Bold. And this is to establish the visual hierarchy so that when a user looks at this website, the first thing that the eye is drawn to is usually the blackest, the boldest, the biggest thing. And we want that to be the title first and then the subheading. As a web designer, very often it's kind of like you're a visual tour guide and you're guiding people through your website. So you want them to read, for example, a big title first, then maybe your brand, then maybe what all these buttons are about. And you can do that quite easily using the font weights and and also the font size. So this is something that you can be aware of the next time you come across a well-designed website. See how they're establishing visual hierarchy and guiding you through the website. So I've already made the title very attractive to the eye. I'm going to tone down the subtitle, the feature text, by changing its color to a gray color so that we make it even lower on the visual hierarchy scale. So the feature text is contained inside some paragraph elements. So I'm going to go ahead and select the paragraph elements, and I'm going to change the color to this grayish color, which is 8F, 8F, 8F. Let's hit save and refresh. And you can see now that visual hierarchy is now unmistakable. There is no way that somebody's eye is going to be drawn to this line before it is drawn to this one. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now, the next thing is we need to add some icons, right? And as I told you, we're going to get that from Font Awesome. So let's head over and let's search for those images. So I've got the heart one and the target and also the check mark, which is in a circle. So we've got these 3 icons and we're just going to copy them in there. So it was check, target, heart. So let's just rearrange this a little bit. So the first one is the check circle. So I'm going to copy that and place it inside our HTML, inside our feature box div, so that everything inside each feature is all grouped together. So that one was circle, the next one was bullseye, so that's going to go here, and the last one was the heart, which is going to go here. All right, so now you'll see that we have our tiny icons here, but that's a little bit too small to see, and we need to make it a little bit larger. So rather helpfully, the Font Awesome icons all come in different sizes. And in order to get a different size, for example, the 3x size, all you have to do is just add the class 3x or 5x or 7x into your Font Awesome icon. So in our case, I'm going to go for maybe the 4x. So we can go ahead and add, so this is Font Awesome symbol, Font Awesome check circle, and Font Awesome 4x. Now, if you refresh, you can see that is now a much larger size, and it's a lot easier to see and actually looks like a feature icon rather than just something very small. So let's go ahead and add that to all 3 other classes. Hit save, and now we have our icons sized and looking pretty good. All right, so now we need to style these icons. We need to give them a color. So in order to style the icons separately from the title and the feature text, then of course we need to give it a custom class. Now, of course, you can use any of the classes that has already been applied to it. But for example, if you pick this class, FA check circle, then you'll have to add more styles to these other 2. Now, if you pick something that's common between all 3, say FAS, that means if you use any Font Awesome symbol, then you're going to be applying the same style to that feature icon as well. So it's always a good idea to apply custom classes when you're trying to style it inside the CSS, unless you're just trying to customize some feature of Font Awesome or of Bootstrap. So in this case, I'm just going to give it a class of icon, and I'm going to paste it in all 3 places, and that allows us to now go into our CSS and style our icon. So our icon is going to be colored in this orangey color, and when we hover over it, it's going to be the same color as this background. So I've already provided those hex values to you. So the normal color is going to be EF8172. Let's hit save and check it out. Looking nice, right? So it'd be nice if there was a little bit of space between this icon and this title, because at the moment they're a bit too squished together. It's kind of sitting right on top of that feature and it doesn't look very good, a bit too mushed together. So let's add a margin bottom to the icon of maybe say just 1 rem. And you can see with just that little bit of space, it looks a lot nicer. Very often small touches can produce really dramatic effects. So the final thing that we want to do for our challenge is make it change color when we hover over the icons. And the color is going to be this same red color in our color palette. So do you remember how to change hover states? Well, we have to use a pseudo class called hover. So we select the icon, we use a colon, and we select one of these pseudo states. And the one that we want is called, I'm never going to get to it. All right, I'm just going to type it in. It's called hover. And we've seen this previously when we looked at classes and pseudo classes and selectors in CSS, but we're going to put it into action in this case. And when our icon is inside the hover state, I'm going to change the color to FF4C68, which is that pinkish color that we've got at the top. So now, dun dun dun, it's changing color. every time we hover over it. And that wasn't even very hard, was it? All right, looking nice. So how did you get on with this challenge? If there was something that you couldn't implement or something you just found out about, then don't worry, go back, change your CSS code, change your HTML code in order to make it work. If you got it all right and it's all looking pretty good, other than maybe you got slightly different values for the margin or the padding, that doesn't matter. You're guessing by eye, right? So that's not a big deal. But it's all about knowing how to use those Bootstrap classes in order to make our features responsive, and also things like, the hover states that we learned before, and knowing how to change the font weight, what to select to change the font color, etc., and all of that good stuff. All right, so in the next lesson, we're going to be looking at another Bootstrap component, which is the carousel. And this is like a slideshow that we're going to implement so that we end up with a really, really cool testimonial section, which allows us to go between all of the different testimonials. So you have all of that to look forward to and more. So I will see you on the next lesson.
Hey, well done for completing yet another module. These modules
All right, welcome back. We've already styled our title section, our features section. So it's now time to style our testimonial section. And we're also going to learn about a Bootstrap component called the carousel, which is going to create a sort of slideshow of all the testimonials that we got from our wonderful customers, like Pebbles over here. But first things first, let's style this section so that it looks nice before we start implementing the carousel. So similar to the feature section, we need to have a bit of padding here. It doesn't look very good to have long lines of text and images and text going right up to the edge. It feels very pure HTML. So let's go ahead and go into Atom, and we can see that in our testimonial section, we've got a section with the ID testimonial. So we can go in here and we can create a new comment. So this is going to be the testimonial section. And we're going to comment that out, and then we're going to target that ID called testimonial, and I can't remember if it was testimonials. Okay, this is really, really important. If your CSS isn't being carried out or something's not going right, always make sure that you check you've got the right selector name and you've spelled it completely correctly. It's very, very easy to make typos, and none of the properties that you set inside here will work otherwise. So firstly, I'm going to add some padding, and it's going to be the same as we had in features. So it's 7% top and bottom and 15% left and right. So now it's a little bit more squished in, and it looks very uniform with the feature section, which I quite like. Now, the next thing is we need to have this text center aligned. It looks weird to have only one line of text that is on the left, and also to have our images on the left as well. So let's go ahead and go into testimonials, change the text align to center. And there we go, looking pretty nice. Now we're going to change the background color. So I want to have the same color as this kind of orangey red color so that we keep to our uniform color palette. So I'm going to style the background of this section to that color. And it's nice when you're creating these kind of one-page websites to have alternating white and colored sections, because at the moment we can't really see where the feature section ends and where the testimonial section starts. So if you're not going to have explicit pages in your website and you're only going to have sections on a one-pager, then it's really, really important that you have some sort of way of giving the user a cue that this is not the same section as this one. So I'm going to change the background color to the same one that we had before, which is this EF8172. And now you can see that that is obviously clearly a different section than this one, right? It's pretty good. And our text can't really be black. It looks very, very odd. So in our colored sections, we tend to have white text, and in our white sections, we tend to have black text. So that works out well. So we can easily change that by just changing the color to FFF and refresh. Nice, looks better. Now, this is way too small for a piece of text that occupies the entire section, so we have to make some changes there as well. So that text is inside an H2, so we can go ahead and change the H2 up here, and I'm going to change the font family to Montserrat Bold, and I'm going to change the font size to maybe 3 rem. And then the line height to 1.5, just to give it more space. And now, voila, we have a very, very proper looking heading for this section, which is our testimonial text. And that is going to draw all the attention of the user so they can see how much people love our product. Now, the next thing I want to change is this image. Firstly, it's way too big, and also I kind of want it to be a round circle profile image. So in order to do that, we need to target this image, and in order to target the image, we of course need a class. So the class is going to be called testimonial image, and hit save, and we're going to copy this over to our styles.css. Now, in most situations, I never recommend copy and pasting, but there's one exception. When you have long class names or something that's a little bit difficult to spell, then it's a good idea just to copy it over and use it as the selector so that you know you definitely haven't made any typos, because this is a very, very common cause of your websites not working the way that they should do when your selector is spelled differently from your class. Even small adjustments, say one letter is capitalized and it's not in the HTML, then it's not going to target the right thing. So now that we've got the testimonial image selected, we can go ahead and make it smaller by changing the width, let's say down to 10%, looking a lot smaller. Then we can make it rounded by, if you remember, changing the border radius to 100%, and that makes it a circle. And we need a little bit of space between this image and basically everything else, too tightly packed with everything else around. So I'm going to give it just maybe a 20 pixel margin all around. And now it's looking a lot nicer. Now, while I'm here, I'm also going to style this press section, which is basically sitting at the bottom of the testimonials. This is kind of the cred section, right? This is when a user lands on your website and sees how much cred you have based on how much other users love you, how much coverage you've had in the media. And so I'm going to group it together in the same section, and I can do that by giving it the same background color. So let's go ahead and check out our press section. It's also got an ID, and we can use that to change some of its styling. So I'm going to target the press section, and I'm going to give it the same background color. And you can see now they look like they belong in the same section. Now I need these images to be center aligned and not aligned all to the left and bunched up like this. So I'm going to add the text align property, and I'm going to change it to center. So now they're all center aligned. And then finally, this section cannot just end so suddenly like this, and we need to basically give it a little bit of a padding from the bottom. Let's add a maybe just padding bottom of say 3%. And now it's lifted up a little bit and it doesn't look like it's so sudden. Now, last thing we need to do is that these logos are way too big. It's kind of stealing the show here. And remember what we spoke about earlier on about visual hierarchy. They can't be as important as the testimonial. So we need to make them smaller. So in order to change the press logos, we need to change these images. And I want to apply the same style to each image. So I need to give them the same custom class. And this is where one of those packages that we installed earlier on really comes into use. There is a package that we installed called Sublime Style Column Selection, and this comes from the Sublime text editor. And this is a feature that I really, really like, especially when you're working with HTML and you have these large stacks of elements and you want to apply the same class to it. I really don't want to just write it, then copy and paste, copy and paste. Nice feature here is that you can hold down the Option key and you can click and drag, and now you have a single cursor that is going to apply the same text to all 4 lines, which is really, really powerful, and I really like it. So I'm going to add class to all 4 lines, and I'm going to call it press logo. So now I have this class press logo that's applied to all 4 images, and that didn't take very much effort from my part at all. So let's go ahead and target the press logos, and let's change their width to make them a little bit smaller. Let's say maybe 15%. Yeah, that looks a lot nicer. And finally, I'm going to add a little bit of space between each of these images so that they don't look all so bunched together. So we can add a margin of say maybe 20 pixels from the top, 20 pixels from the left and right, and then 50 pixels from the bottom. And this will give it a bit of space between each logo, but also separate it from the testimonial section and also the bottom of this colored section. So I'm quite happy with that design, and we can now proceed to look at something a little bit more exciting.
Wow.
I'll proceed to look at something a little bit more exciting.
Lên luôn. Ok.
it's a little bit boring just to have a single testimonial, right? That seems like only one person ever used our app and actually liked it. So I'm sure there's more than one person who likes our product, right? I hope so. So we're going to use something called the Bootstrap Carousel. And this is kind of like a slideshow that allows you to go through different content. And you've got the ones where it's kind of automated, like you've got over here, but you've got another one which is more manual, which is the one that we're going to use, where you can toggle through all the different slides. And in our case, each slide is just going to be a new testimonial from a new person, so that we can show off how many people love our product. So let's first have a play around with it using a code play. So if you go to the first example where there's slides only and copy the code here into a new code play playground, and of course remember to change your framework if you need to, and paste that code into the HTML section. So now let's hit run. Now it is working, but in this case there's no source for the images, so they're not really showing up. Instead of looking for images and messing around with this, I'm simply going to select the carousel item, which is the class that is the div that contains each slide. And I'm simply going to give it a height of, say, 500 pixels. And I'm going to go into the div and I'm going to add an inline style. So style equals background color, red. And I'm going to add this inline style to all 3 slides. And the first one's going to be the red, second one's going to be yellow, third one is going to be blue. Blue. Hit run, and now let's pop it out to see what this looks like. So this is our first slide, which is red, and it says first slide. Our image is not working because we couldn't be bothered to find a valid image, but if you did put one in there, then it would work just fine. And now, after what seems like forever, our second slide has just slid into view. This one's yellow, this one says second slide, and if we have the patience and do not fall asleep before the third one comes along, then there we go, we've got a third slide as well. Now, it's a little bit slow, isn't it? And, you know, if you're on an actual website, it's probably not a great idea to have very fast carousels because it's kind of annoying. But how can you change the speed? Now, if we go into the Bootstrap documentation and we look at the usage options, which you can get to by clicking down here, then you can see that there's quite a few different options that we can actually change about these carousels. We can change, for example, the interval, which is the amount of time delay between cycling the items. Now, the default is 5,000 milliseconds. That's the unit here, even though it's not really said here. So 5,000 milliseconds is basically 5 seconds. Now, if we wanted to speed it up, we can change that interval to, let's say, maybe every second. So we go into the div that is our carousel, which is here. And as it says here, you have to append the option name, which is called interval, to data dash. So for example, data interval equals this. So we're going to go in here and we're going to add that attribute data dash interval, and we're going to set it to equal to 1000, which is going to be 1000 milliseconds, or basically cycling every second. So let's hit run, and now every second our carousel is changing its slide. Now, before I blind you, there's a whole bunch of other options that you can change. For example, should the carousel react to keyboard values? So for example, going left and right. Should it be paused when the cursor is hovering over the carousel? So let's go ahead and see what some of those things might look like. So let's, for example, add the one where we can pause on hover. So let's add the attribute called data-pause, and it's going to equal to hover. Now, if we hit run, our slides will continue going at the speed of light, but once I put my cursor inside it, then it will pause, which is quite a nice feature. And some websites are too lazy to implement this, which is really frustrating when I want to read what's on that particular slide in the carousel. Now, another thing that we can change is the slide class here. So if we removed that from the carousel class, then you can see that it no longer slides, but just changes to the next carousel item. But I quite like this sliding animation, so I'm going to put it back in. And the final one I want to show you is how do you stop this autoplay? Well, you can change ride. So data ride over here, if it's equal to carousel, will just autoplay. If it's set to false, then it will only play if you tell it to, through maybe the keyboard buttons or through some carousel buttons. So it's not autoplaying anymore. So how do we change the slides? How do we go from slide 1 to slide 2? Well, if we have a look in the docs, there's another type of carousel which has controls. So it has these buttons that lets us go between the different slides. And that's what I want to implement for our Tindog website. So how can we do this? So I want to have a static carousel that doesn't autoplay. So I'm going to leave data ride equals false. Now I don't need a data interval anymore because that only applies to the animation of auto scrolling between the different slides. And data pause and hover I also don't need because it's stopped by default. So now if we look inside this example which has the controls, then you can see that the difference between this one and the previous one that didn't have controls is that it has some buttons down here. It has a carousel control previous and a carousel control next. So let's go ahead and copy these two buttons over to our code play. And you can see down here, they've put in it just above the last div. So we're going to do exactly the same. So now if we hit run and we pop it out, you'll see that we now have buttons, but they don't work yet. Now, the reason is because as with all of these Bootstrap buttons, they have a href that targets the carousel. And it needs to be the same name as the ID of your carousel. So for example, in this case, the ID is carousel example slide only, but this href is targeting something called carousel example controls. And that's because in the second example, the ID was called carousel example controls. So let's change this. Let's make it target something like just called testimonial carousel. And we can make that the same href for the previous as well as the next buttons. And of course, we need to change the actual ID of the carousel over here. So now, whenever each of these buttons are pressed, they target the carousel that we've got in place. And now if I run our code, you can see that when I press on the buttons, it actually changes through the slides. And it works both for the next and the previous buttons. Now, let's go through each and every line of this code just so that we understand fully what it's all about. So the first thing is a div that has the ID of the carousel. And this, of course, remember, needs to be unique across your page. Next, we add some custom Bootstrap classes, which is carousel, which says that this div is going to be a carousel, and slide, which, if you remember from earlier on, says that our slides should animate in from the right or left rather than simply just appearing. Data ride equals false means that it doesn't autoplay, so we've got that line sorted. Next, we've got the Carousel Inner, and this is going to contain the contents of the carousel items, so the slides that will be changed. Inside Carousel Inner, we've got 3 carousel items, and the first one, the first page that you want to show on your website, so when you load up your website, the first slide is marked with an active class, and you have to have one of these carousel items being marked as the active class. Now, the next thing is some inline style that we put in just to be able to distinguish the 3 slides from each other. And then inside each of these, we've got some content. So you can have an image or you can have, say, an H1. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't change anything about the carousel. And in fact, later on, we're going to be putting our custom testimonials inside here as the carousel item content. So we can ignore these images like here and here. Then we get to our 2 buttons. So the first button has the class carousel control previous, and that is this left button over here. And it has an href to know which carousel to target, because you can have multiple carousels in your HTML, right? So it needs to know which one it should affect. Then the role of it is the button. Now, ideally, you want to use an anchor tag as the HTML element that's going to be the button, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something like an H1 that you might want to assign the role of button to. Right, so this is what it's all about. You have to add this role equals button to change our anchor tag into a button. Next is data slide previous. So this says which direction should your carousel slide. So this is going backwards and this one is going forwards. And the next line is a span, and this is the button icon. So this little arrow over here. And this comes from Bootstrap by adding in that class. And aria hidden equals true. Now, this is something that we saw in the nav bar as well. We didn't really talk about it too much. But aria hidden basically means that when a visually impaired person comes across your website, they usually have something called a screen reader, which goes through the website and reads what is on there so they can hear what we can see. Now, for things like buttons, you don't really want the screen reader to read out left button, right button, or, previous button, next button. So you have this thing called ARIA hidden, which basically means make the screen reader skip over this button span so that the visually impaired person doesn't have to listen to what all the buttons are. And this goes towards, making your website more accessible and friendly to people with disabilities. And this is actually a really, really big topic and a really, really important topic as well. So you can either keep it in or you can delete it, but just remember about your users who might be visually impaired. Now, the last span that we see in here is called SR only, and this stands for screen reader only. And that is what we said before, right? So instead of telling the user that there is a carousel control previous icon button, instead it just says previous on the screen reader. So you can either delete this if you're not planning on being accessible to people who have visual impairments, or you can include it and make sure that your website is more inclusive. Now, in our case, I'm actually going to get rid of it just because we're learning something new and want to keep the code as clean and pure as possible. So now this is what we've got as our carousel, and this is what we would like to implement in our website. So I like to test out the code in something like CodePlay before I put it into the website when it starts interacting with everything else, and it could lead to issues. So I want to have a pure version that's just working exactly as I need it to, and then I can transplant it into the website. So let's go ahead and copy all of this HTML over here, and we're going to put it into our index.html for our TinDog website. And I'm going to place it inside the testimonial section, of course. So now you might notice that there is this section that has been commented out. So if you select it and you hold down Command on Mac or Control on Windows, then you press the / button, then it will uncomment it and take it back into the flow of our website. So we now have 2 testimonials. So we can change our code to have 2 carousel items. So I'm going to delete the third one, basically. And the first one is no longer going to have the H1 of hello, but instead it's going to have this first testimonial with pebbles that we saw earlier on. And the second one is going to be from Beverly from Illinois. I feel like I'm on a game show. Beverly from Illinois, you have just one. Not very much. So now that we've updated that, let's just check to make sure that everything else is in order. And one thing that we've transplanted over that we don't really want or need are these inline styles. So we can get rid of our inline styles that changes the background color because we have a beautiful background color already. So let's hit save and let's hit refresh. And you can see we now have a testimonial. And if I go left or right, then you can see that it's scrolling through the 2 different testimonials I've got. And obviously, if you have more, then you can keep adding them in, right? And the nice thing is that all the styles that I added previously, because I've got all the classes in place in the second testimonial, I didn't have to add or change any styling at all. Now, there's just one last eyesore that I want to fix before we finish off this section. And that is, I'd really like these buttons to be further out here so that they're not so close to my testimonial text because it looks a little bit weird to my eye. Now, the reason why that's happening is because our padding is applied to the testimonial section. So this entire section is the testimonial section. And if you have a look on Chrome Developer Tools, then you can see that it has quite a lot of padding around all 4 sides. And that is squishing in these buttons here. So in order to change that, we can apply the padding to only the parts that we want to be padded. So what we can do instead is we can apply that padding to each carousel item so that the content inside the carousel items are padded. So the H2, the image, and the EM, they're all bunched in the center. But to have the buttons outside of that padding so that it has more space and it's more visible and more easy to click on. So to do that, all we need to do is to target the carousel item, and we're going to move the padding from the testimonial section, which is section wide, to only inside the carousel item. So now if we hit save and refresh, then you can see our buttons are now all the way out here. And if you take a look at pesticide, you can see that the buttons are now occupying a much larger space and it's hard to miss. So if you click anywhere in this section, it will scroll through the testimonials. But our padding for our carousel items are still in place and it still looks exactly the way that it did before, just we now have more logically placed buttons. So I hope you enjoyed this section of learning about the Bootstrap Carousel, and it might be worth for you to have a play around with some of the other examples that they've shown inside your CodePlay playground. But in the next lesson, we're going to learn about another Bootstrap component, which is really, really useful, and that's the Bootstrap Cards. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. All right, so it's looking pretty good as we are already. We've got our title section styled, our features page, our testimonial part styled, and now it's just a matter of styling the pricing section down here. And this is a commonly used component on many websites that you go to. You'll see a pricing table, so you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. And in fact, if you remember from earlier on, if we have a look at the Bootstrap examples, you'll see that one of the examples is just a pricing page that was built using Bootstrap. So we can actually just copy this component and put it into our website and style it up and then customize the style to our liking. So let's see how we can do that. So if you open up the Chrome Developer Tools and you click on this arrow, then we can start selecting the parts that we want. Now, there's quite a few different divs around here. For example, there's this top pricing header, there's this part which is the entire body, and then there's like sort of down here, which is a container that contains the footer as well as the pricing table. But if we navigate to around here, we've got this card deck that includes nothing but just the pricing table. So that's basically what we want. And if you click on the drop down menu, you can see that this is what it contains. So let's take a closer look at this. So if you right click on this card deck and you hit copy element, and we head over to, again, CodePlay, and we start a new playground. We can paste it into here and of course change our Bootstrap version and now hit run, and you can see that we've got a ready-made pricing table that we can just paste into our project. Now, of course, you can change the code as you wish. So for example, this button down here, it's a button large outline primary, so that's the blue color. So what if we wanted it to be outline dark, for example? Then we end up with outline dark, a black button. And you can go through this and modify the parts that you want, and of course change the relevant bits of text to what your company is going to advertise. But essentially, this is a really, really quick and easy way of importing and using components. And it's not just Bootstrap examples that you can look at the code from. There's a website called Bootsnip, which I recommend you to take a look at, where they've got snippets of code for all sorts of different components that you can look at and refer to and see how they were created. So for example, if you wanted to look for a, I don't know, maybe like a login screen, then you can see that there's many, many different things that people have styled up and created the components. And you can look at the HTML and the CSS that was needed to create this. And you can, of course, incorporate it into your own project, depending on the licensing for each of these components. But, you know, in our case, we're learning about Bootstrap. So as always, we want to understand what we're doing before we start just blindly copy and pasting code. So let's try and understand how this pricing table was constructed and create our own using the same underlying Bootstrap components. So in the example code that you see here, the word that comes up the most often is this word card. And this is because what they're using here in order to create this pricing table is a Bootstrap component called Bootstrap Cards. And this provides a container that looks something like this. So you can have an image at the top, a title, some text, and a button. And because in most cases, a lot of websites need something like this, they've made it easy for you to incorporate this using Bootstrap. So the card's a little bit like your HTML. They have a header, they have a body, and they can also have a footer if you so wish. So let's head over to our CodePen and just hit Command A, and we're going to delete all of our existing HTML code. Now let's create a card from scratch with a header, a body, and a footer. And we can do that by following the documentation code over here. So the first thing that we'll need is a div with the class that's card. So this is going to be a card. And inside here, we're going to have a card header, a card body, and a card footer. So that's going to be 3 divs. And the first one is going to have the class of card header. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this. And I'm going to create the other 2, which is going to be card body and card footer. And then if I hit run, it's actually quite hard to see what's going on here. So I'll add some text. So for example, this is the card header, card body, and card footer. All right, let's hit run. And you can see that this is what our card currently looks like. It's taking up the full width of the screen, which is why it's going from edge to edge, styling the different sections slightly differently. So the header has this little shadow up here, and it's highlighted in a sort of light gray color, and the body is white. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this last div, which is the card footer, which we don't really need. And I'm just going to copy the rest of the code so that we can, again, transplant it into our website. So in the pricing section, just below the title section and the subtitle, I'm going to paste our card in here. And I'm going to delete where it says card header and card body. Now we're going to need 3 of these because we have 3 pricing plans at the moment, and each of them are going to be a single Bootstrap card, just as they did over here in their pricing example. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this twice more so that we have 3 cards. And I'm going to move some of this content over. So for example, Chihuahua is going to be in the card header. That's the name of the pricing plan, and the rest of this content is going to be inside the card body. And we're going to do the same for the other 2 pricing tiers. All right, so let's just go ahead and beautify, and we're done. All right, so let's hit save and see what this looks like as it is. And you can see that similar to what we saw on CodePlay, they're actually taking up the full width of the page at the moment. Now we need to change that to make them stack side by side like so. Now in the case of this Bootstrap example, what they've done is they've used this class called a card deck. So let me show you what that does. So all we need is a div that is going to go around all 3 of our cards, and it's going to have the class of card deck. And then I'm going to move this closing div all the way down to here so that all 3 of our cards go inside the card deck div. So now if we hit save and we head over to our website and refresh, then you can see that automatically by wrapping all of our cards inside a card deck, they get distributed evenly across the width of the website, and they also end up with the same height. Now, there's just one problem with card decks. They're not quite as adaptable as the Bootstrap grid system. Now, if we take a look at the Bootstrap docs for cards, you can see that they've already got you sorted. So under using grid markup, you can see that you can actually place these cards inside our beloved Bootstrap grid system in order to size them accordingly to how responsive you want your website to be. So we should really know how to do this, but here's something new to challenge us. How can you make the 3rd card become 100% at the iPad width, so basically medium and below, but keep the other 2 only 50%, but only when you get onto the full mobile size do you make all 3 100% the width of the screen. So at this point, you've already seen and know quite a lot about Bootstrap grids, so I'm going to leave this to you as a challenge. So pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so this is a little bit different, so it might have been quite challenging, but let's see if you got it right. So let's go through the solution now. The first thing that you need for any sort of grid system to work is you need a div class of row. So I'm going to replace card deck with row in this case, because it's a little bit easier to work with in our case. Now, the next thing that we need to do is to wrap each of our cards inside a Bootstrap grid. So I'm going to create another div, and I'm going to give this a class of column large 4, because by default, when we're on the larger sizes, so laptop and desktop sizes, I want each card to take up 4 units, so that's 1/3 of the page. And that behavior I really want to have for all 3 cards. So I'm going to add the same for the other 2 as well. Column large 4 for the second card, and also for our last card. Let's just beautify that. All right, cool. So now that means that on laptop and desktop, it should take up 1/3 of the width. Now let's drill in a little bit deeper and specify what we want on iPad, which is the medium size. So on the medium size, we want the top 2 to take up half of the width. So that's going to be column medium 6. And I'm going to apply that to this one as well. So these 2 are going to be 50% on iPad, but the last one is either going to be column medium 12 to say that on the medium sizes, it should take up a full 12 units, so the full width. Or if you remember, if you don't specify any columns, it just defaults to 100%. So that means any size that's below large is just going to be 100%. And in this case, any size below medium is going to be 100%. So now if you hit save and refresh, and we start going down to our iPad size, you can see that we've got 1, 2, and 3, and then finally to our mobile size, 1, 2, 3. So that's looking pretty neat. Now, the next challenge I have for you is I want you to make these buttons match the Bootstrap example styles. So have it the same as these buttons. So namely, they're going to take up the full width of the card. The first one's going to be an outline button. The second 2 are going to be solid buttons, and it's all going to have the dark theme. So pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so this one should be easy because we've done this quite a few times. So let's head into our HTML and start adding some more Bootstrap classes. So our button currently doesn't have any classes, so we need to add some, and we're going to add BTN so that it styles it as a Bootstrap button, and then we're going to have BTN large to specify that we want the larger button, and then we're going to say BTN block so that the button takes up the full width of the card, and finally the first one is going to be a BTN outline dark button, and the other two buttons are going to have pretty much the same classes, apart from the fact that they're not going to be outline buttons and they're going to be just BTN dark, as in the solid buttons. So let's hit save and let's refresh, and voila, our beautiful buttons have appeared. So now all we need to do is just to change the CSS a little bit to customize the layout and the text. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of padding from all sides. So let's head into styles.css, and the part that I'm going to put the padding on is this pricing section. So I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to add the pricing section. And here I'm going to target the pricing selector. Let's just check the spelling. Pricing looks good. And then I'm going to add that padding, which is going to be roughly around 100 pixels all four sides. And that gives it a little bit more space and it looks a lot nicer. Now, it's rare that you want this kind of static amount of padding on all sizes, but I find that with the pricing plan, even on mobile, you need a little bit of space all four sides. So I think it works quite well. Now, of course, if you feel different to how I feel, then feel free to change it to however you want it to. But I quite like the way that this is spaced out. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of padding around each of these columns that holds a card so that we push it down away from this title section and also give them a bit more space from each other. So let's go ahead into index.html and give each of these columns a class name. So I'm just going to call this a pricing column, and I'm going to paste this class across all three cards. All right, so now let's hit save and we can go ahead and select that pricing column, and then we're going to add some padding in here. So the amount that I'm going to add is roughly around, I think 3% from the top and bottom, and then just 2% from the left and right, so from each of the cards. So now if we refresh, you can see that there's a healthy bit of space that moves the pricing table away from this title, and also we have a little bit more space between each of the cards. Now, the last thing I want to do is just to make all the content inside the card center aligned, because our buttons are center aligned and it looks kind of weird when it's all left aligned and it's not lined up with the button. So in order to do that, I can go into the pricing section and change the text align property to center, hit save and refresh, and this is our beautiful pricing section. And you can see that took really very little effort at all, and you should now understand how each of these cards work and all of the components that we put inside, for example the button or the card header. So this is a very, very simple pricing page that we've created ourselves without having to rely on the example code, and you can see that we're pretty close to what theirs look like, and that didn't really take very long at all. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about some more advanced CSS rather than Bootstrap, and it's so that we can try and get our image to go behind this feature section so that it can cut it off at around this point, because at the moment this is a little bit too big and I want the section to end right about here, so we have to move this image behind this feature section. So we're going to talk about the z-index and the CSS stacking order. All of that is yet to come, and I'll see you on the next lesson. All right, so
Rồi rồi, nghe rồi. Nó đã tẻ quá bạn. Ở đây là immediate, intermediate. Nhiều mà.